So the last thing that I want to talk about in this conversation about education is really to introduce you or even reintroduce you to some terms that might be relevant talking about education from a symbolic interactionist perspective. Interestingly, in order to do that, in some ways, I'm going to link what these terms are to the things that maybe functionalists will talk about or even social conflict theorists will talk about. So for instance, one of the first things or one of the things that I'd like to talk about in my face-to-face classes that I'll make sure that I do here is there are these three quick videos that I share. One of them is a link or like a 1 minute clip from a movie called Waiting for Superman. It's a documentary talking about sort of charter schools and special programs in New York City. And I'll make sure I do that thing where it's linking. It's just a minute. And what it does is show this student who is facing the potential of being tracked in a lower track in her educational career because she doesn't test very well. And so the first thing that this quick clip allows you to see is just how tracking looks or is happening in an animated way. Essentially, one of those things to make the distinction is between tracking and sorting. And again, I'm sorry I don't have my whiteboard here, but tracking or sorting, let me give you that definition first. Sorting, and you can find this in your book, it's classifying students based on academic merit or potential. One of the ways that you might see this or might even remember this in elementary school is you may be placed in the reading group 1 versus reading group 2 versus reading group 3. And if you have those different reading groups based on your skill or any additional assistance you may need, you might find that it's reading time for everybody, but we all have different reading assignments. Or it's reading time for group 1 and math time for group 2. And then you switch flip-flop so that you might be sorted or grouped in that classroom based on your needs. And that's a really good thing for a teacher to be able to do, I imagine, because then at least we can make sure that the students get what they need, that students who need extra help get extra help, students who are ready to be pushed, maybe they get pushed. But one of the things about sorting is that it happens within that classroom or within that activity. That distinction is very different from what we understand to be tracking. Tracking is doing that kind of sorting in a more formal, systematic way. It's a formalized sorting system that places students on tracks that we believe perpetuate inequalities. So that track you've heard could be like regular students, the honor students, the developmental students, or the gifted students. And what you see in this animated clip is, he says there's a school official that makes some determination as to which one of these tracks you're going to be on. What's important about that is that some of those tracks are determined, or your positioning on that track sometimes is determined very much so based on your tests, your academics. We can have a whole other debate about whether or not standardized tests are reflective of your actual academic skill, but it is one of the measures that might be used to place you on a track. The other thing that he says is that some people are tracked or placed on some of these tracks based on other things about how neat do you look, or how polite are you, or how well do you follow rules. Again, that distinction between formal and informal sort of education or cultural expectations. But it really even points to the idea that how neat a person might be or how they interact with authority might be a symptom or a symbol of their socioeconomic status. Maybe I can be neater in my clothes when my clothes are brand new off the rack versus another kid whose clothes have been handed down a number of generations or from like a number of his siblings, right? One of us might just look neater. If I grew up in a household where I get to interact with a number of adults or participate in a lot of cultural events or go to the museums or go to the movies all the time, I might have accumulated a whole lot more comfort talking to adults, or I may have accumulated a lot more vocabulary words, or I might have what we might call hooks, a whole lot of examples that I can make to make what's going on in school relevant to what I saw with other things. I got more hooks to hang information on. That is symptomatic, or that is a indicator of socioeconomic status, not necessarily academic skill or ability. But when the social official gets to make a determination as to what track you're on, then they can make that determination based on some of those indicators and not necessarily based on your academic skills and abilities. So this distinction of what's happening in the class that's being sort of sorted for your academic skill in the room follows you outside of that classroom. If you are in Mrs. Pate's class, then that means you are going to Mrs. Washington's class, and then that means you're going to Mr. Martinez's class, and that's the pathway. And somebody else is going from Miss Smith to Miss Johnson, to Mr. Hoboken, whatever. That's that path. It's very clear. And once you're on that path, whatever that track is, it's hard for you to get off that track. You almost certainly can't go up a track, and at worst, maybe you fall off a track, but you are going to be tracked. The second video that I'd like to talk about in my class is a young woman who is doing a TED Ed talk, and she's talking about having been tracked as a gifted student. And she recalls at 5 years old taking something like an IQ test to check on her reasoning and skills and things. And those tests are written in such a way that you don't yet have to be a reader. And she was tracked as a gifted student. And she talks about, a good watch. It's just 5 minutes. She talks about sort of the pressures that came with being considered gifted, because now there were these extra expectations on her. She might make the same mistakes or have the same behavioral developmental issue as anybody else, but somehow it's just like, oh no, but more is expected of you because you are gifted. And she says you put this kind of pressure on yourself because you're gifted, and people are talking about you're gifted and you have this special brain. But she says she was still kind of young when she realized, and she looked amongst herself with other people, that maybe there's nothing special about my brain and my abilities at all. Maybe what we're seeing is that I was raised in the kind of household with parents that were able to provide resources for me that then allowed me to perform in ways that other people couldn't. So that my giftedness really was just an indicator of my socioeconomic status. All parents want their children to do well, right? All parents want their children to have access to the world and experience everything, but not all parents can do that. So the parents who can do that usually will lead to students who have the benefit that comes along with that. And so they may then be tracked in a higher way than another way. This last video clip that I often show is that the truth of it is one of those tracks is straight through the criminal justice system, the school to prison pipeline. And this video talks about the idea that if you are in one of those more affluent schools, for instance, you're more likely to have the kinds of support systems to deal with students who need additional help. Whether those be chronic conditions or social behavioral conditions, they just need extra help, or emotional issues and they're not working very well in the classroom. Then there's maybe a paraprofessional, a teaching aide, maybe classrooms are smaller sizes. There's additional counselors or social workers in the building, versus where you might see a public school in Rockford, for instance. There is a social worker, but he or she needs to be at 3 different schools throughout the week. So how much attention can that social worker give to any particular student? So when you have a school that is literally under-resourced, sometimes what you might see, this video talked about, is the presence of a resource officer, literally an officer of the criminal justice system, a law enforcement officer. Because if you remember, a law enforcement officers, when you listen to that word, a law is just a formalized norm. It is the thing that they are called to do as a social control mechanism to restore order. So if you have a child in a classroom, literally a child, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, out of order in a classroom, and you don't have the resources to call the psychologist or make sure that they've had the help that they needed in the first place, then it might be the police that come to help. because the teacher's like, I don't have enough resources to manage this issue, so I need somebody to come get this child. Children have been arrested for doing out of order things that might even be children-like, right? And sometimes then that is the track you're placed on. We know that once a person has an interaction with the criminal justice system, that they're likely to have an additional interaction with the criminal justice system. So I tell you about those 3 videos, often talking about the ways that inequalities get created or perpetuate themselves in society. So something that a social conflict theorist would be interested in, to really point out some things that a symbolic interactionist would say about something like tracking, especially tracking this school to prison pipeline. It's a reminder of a term that we talked about when we were talking about deviance, that I specifically said this will come up again in education. It's the idea of labeling. So if you're looking for the definition of that, go back to the chapter on deviance. Labeling is the ascribing of a deviant behavior to another person by members of a society. What that means is, for instance, is that if you are on the track of behavioral problem, for instance, then that is your label and it's going to follow you. You might be sorted in your classrooms in that way. You might even be tracked in your classrooms in that way. That same label that you are gifted, for instance, is going to be attached to you and follow you throughout your educational experience. No different than you might be designated as a math person. If you're designated a math person and you're put in the advanced or the special math group, then you're going to be pushed in math. You're going to be supported in math, and you will very highly likely become a math person. That self-fulfilling prophecy we talked about. So how you understand and label children, either in these informal ways in the classroom, these sorting ways, and sometimes these very long-standing, formalized, systematic tracking ways, those labels will follow that experience. And if you have that kid who has had the police call on them, then that kid is just going to be expected to be a problem. Even when they're not a problem, there's the anticipation that they're going to be a problem. So they might even spend more time in the principal's office instead of the classroom because you're simply expecting that they're going to be a problem. So I wanted to remind you of this idea of labeling. This thing comes up again when we're talking about students with disabilities, for instance, and sometimes even the idea of students who have behavioral issues or behavior that teachers don't have the resources to accommodate or figure out. Sometimes those problem students are sent into tracks, for instance, where they are treated as if they have special education needs when maybe they don't, or that the diagnosis of such is maybe not ever truly clear. What they may have had was some developmental, behavioral, child things, for instance, that tend to get tracked in that way. And when we talk about that stratification system, we're not talking about men being privileged and girls not. We're honestly talking about a reversal of that system. Boys more than girls are tend to be labeled as deviant. We know this. They tend to be more so tracked in these special education programs or tracks, whether they actually need that versus it's just a behavioral issue, for instance, that we don't have the resources to deal with. And this is part of the reason why we see that school to prison pipeline, because they get dealt with in criminal justice ways instead of having the resources to deal with whatever social or emotional or behavioral issue that they may have. The other word that I've talked about before that I said would come up again in this conversation about education is hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum, your book says, maybe I think we were talking about culture, the type of non-academic knowledge that people learn through informal learning and cultural transmission. You've already heard me talk about informal learning, the distinction between formal and informal, and cultural transmission, these cultural ideas that we pass on that we consider to be important. Sometimes that hidden curriculum, again, when you think about that formal curriculum, you are supposed to learn these basic math operations, these basic reading and writing techniques. Some of that other stuff, we don't write it down as formal. you must learn how to share, for instance, but it is there, it is hidden, and it is very commonly taught. So we might say that that's part of the hidden curriculum. The other thing that's really important, or maybe what's more important, social conflict theorists might say about the hidden curriculum going on in educational environments is, again, the ways that people might be tracked, which of those behaviors are most desirable. So on the one hand, we teach you how to ask questions, but it's more desirable that you don't ask questions of authority. We teach you how to speak up for yourself, but we don't exactly desire somebody who's outspoken enough to stand up for themselves, right? So there's this hidden curriculum sometimes that says, these are the things that you need to know that is going to benefit you culturally versus not going to benefit you so much. And you can think about that. I may have mentioned this term before, cultural capital. So think about capital like the money that you have in your wallet that you can trade for something that you need. Well, sometimes you can trade on cultural characteristics. When we think about, again, the wealthy or the affluent used to, have time to go to the ballet, and they know things about literature, and they know things about sort of these worldly things. Imagine you are stuck in an elevator with the person who is the CEO of the company that you want to work for. Well, you are in a much better situation if you know about the things that you can talk to that person about. Having that kind of capital in your pocket, this cultural understanding that you can pull out and talk to that person, would put you in a great, great big beneficial position, right? Versus somebody who might be stuck with the CEO and they don't have that cultural capital. So when we're talking about hidden curriculum, we're not only talking about those things that are informal versus formally part of the curriculum. We're talking about the fact that there are some things that are not only taught to you informally, but valuable for the culture. And because we've had these unequal systems, there's some people who are getting some types of cultural capital that put them in a much better position than what other people are getting. So I've talked to you about sorting and tracking, and I've talked to you about labeling, a revisitation of labeling, and then a mention of cultural capital. The last thing that I want to talk about that's more like sort of this idea of the function of education is this terminology of credentials. Or credentialism. A credential is usually just the thing that you get. You finish an education program and you get a credential, a certificate or a diploma. You go to high school to get a high school diploma. You go to community college to get an associate degree. You go to bachelor school to four-year school to get a bachelor's degree, right? Those are your credentials. The thing with, we know that one of the functions of formal education is to provide these systematic ways for you to be prepared for the workforce. And the ways that you go through formal educational process in order to be prepared for the workforce is that you follow these very scripted pathways in order to get that credential. So not crazy at all. Credentialism, though, from this sort of functionalist approach is an accusation that maybe those credentials have become over time a symbol of what a person has achieved or what a person knows in such a way that we allow the labeling of that person and maybe even devaluing the education. So credentialism is the emphasis on certificates and degrees to show that a person has a specific skill or has attained a certain level of education or has met certain job characteristics or qualifications. The idea is it the certification or is it the credential that tells me that you know what I need you to know to work here? Or is it the fact that you actually know these things? The accusation is maybe educational institutions, educational organizations have become less concerned with what you actually learn. Are you actually picking up these skills? Are you actually becoming more culturally competent or more academically prepared? Or are you getting sort of shifted through the processes, the bureaucracies of it, in order to walk away with the credential? Because as an institution, we all look better if we can tell you how many of these credentials did we confer last year, for instance, but did we create a more educated group of people who went through those credentials? And don't even wake up now that you can somehow sometimes get through classes never having learned a thing if ChatGPT can help you do the work, or get through classes if they run for 2 weeks and all you had to do was pay tuition and for the most part you'll pass. You can almost buy yourself a credential in that way, but that means you have a credential in your pocket that is usable that somebody else has that they worked really hard for. So there is a question, there is a debate on whether or not credentialism is the downfall of the educational process, that we are focusing too much on the thing that people get to symbolize what it is they know or what they can do, instead of what it is they actually know or what it is they do. So those sort of meanings that we attach to those things associated with education or the process itself is why I'm telling you that those are kind of symbolic interactionist approaches. But you can see it's hard to even talking about those approaches without talking about that fundamental question of what is education about? And those fundamental questions is, what's the function of it on purpose? What is it that we're trying to do? All the way into, are we creating inequality or reflecting inequality? And then all the way back, what are we trying to do in the first place? And who's going to be responsible for that? And even who's going to pay for it? For me, that kind of stuff is fascinating. I don't know what the answers to those questions are, but that's what those debates are. So that's the end of education.